Merci beaucoup. Bonjour. Merci beaucoup de m'avoir invité à présenter aujourd'hui. Donc, voici la 5e présentation de l'après-midi. Donc, j'espère que je vais réussir à vous intéresser à ce sujet. J'ai préparé ma présentation en anglais, donc je vais passer en anglais. Je pense que ce sera sympa pour ceux qui ne sont pas francophones dans la salle. Et voilà, je ne savais pas en fait dans quelle langue présenter, donc j'ai choisi l'anglais. Henri presented me. My name is Zoe. I work with FAO. It's the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. It's the specialized agency of the UN for food security, agriculture, and rural development. We're not a development bank, as you probably know, but we're a facilitator of policy dialogue, knowledge exchange, a standard setter in this field, and we're also a provider of technical assistance. It's also important to know that we're a big intergovernmental organization, and I myself and my colleagues will report to 192 nations from the north and the south, which are our member nations. So today I'm going to briefly present why development strategies that take into account resilience are essential to tackle food insecurity, especially in countries that are highly vulnerable, and which host some of the poorest of the poor. We were talking of the poorest of the poor earlier on. This topic is at the heart of FAO strategy because it's particularly relevant to the agricultural sector. I'll mention that. And it's also a topic that I'm particularly fond of. I've worked on a resilience strategy for Somalia, and so I'm going to bring up the example of Somalia in just a moment. I don't know if this works. How does it work? Uh-oh. Alors, slowly. Okay, so there is now a consensus, I would say, in the community that I work in, that resilience is an essential dimension of food insecurity and food security. Resilience is not something you can touch, but it's something that you can measure. Yeah. Food security. Food security is something extremely complex and multidimensional. It's much more than having food that's available on the market, either from local production or from imports. It's also making sure that people have access to food geographically, and that they have the financial means to access the food, and that they can also utilize food, and they have access to nutritious and diversified diets. So today, we've made a lot of progress globally on food security. Global food insecurity has fallen by 17% in 10 years, although there are great disparities across the world. But there is still roughly 1% out of 8 that suffers from chronic hunger, which is obviously very, very unacceptable. It is particularly challenging, it is even more challenging today to continue this progress towards reducing food insecurity, because we live in a changing world. And this is the subtitle of the conference, I see. Today we live in a world that's characterized by climate change, food price volatility, increased localized conflicts or increased regionalized conflict, if you think about Syria today. And all of that are disasters and global risk, which puts food security much more at threat, than before. We know that disasters, for instance, those that are related to climate, have tripled since 1980. However, those shocks are problematic for food security, but they are not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is vulnerability. The biggest problem is that the poorest countries, and within the poorest countries, the most vulnerable, are those that are going to be hit hardest by those shocks. Why? Because they have greater exposure to risk. Henri mentioned it earlier, talking about the Mediterranean. They have higher vulnerabilities, and they also lack the adaptive capacities that are going to help them cope with those shocks. And this is why resilience to shocks and building resilience for the most vulnerable in particular is absolutely essential. So the equation is the combination of risk, the exposure to this risk, the vulnerability, and the capacity to cope. Building resilience is basically helping them that have this limited capacity to withstand the shocks and the stresses better, and to minimize as much as possible the impact on their lives and on their livelihoods. If you think about the risks that we face, like we said, the risk can be very acute and very visible. Those are disasters. So we all think of earthquakes, tsunamis, and the like in recent years, but those might not be the most problematic. The shocks, which are the second ones in my little box, that are more discrete, are the ones that are quite problematic for ensuring food security, of everyday people in everyday life. And these shocks are a bad agricultural season, a local river that's flooding, or the road to the local market that is being blocked by too much rain or by a checkpoint. Those shocks are the ones that are going to make food security very problematic. Finally, we have stresses, so those more structural phenomena, such as, for instance, climate change, typically, which slowly erode also vulnerability and the capacity to cope and limit resilience. The problem is when disasters, shocks, stresses, a myriad of them, a variety of them have been happening, resilience is extremely low, people's vulnerability is extremely high, and then the smallest shock can basically, a very small shock, can lead to very devastating outcomes. So this is why we focus on resilience. This is the rationale, and we work on the three last variables. So working on resilience, everything I've said is, it's sort of intuitive, it's sort of common knowledge. I don't think it's groundbreaking. But to focus on resilience is actually quite a groundbreaking change in the way we work in the international development community. We're not going to use any new, ingredient to what we do. I mean, the solutions are always the same, of course. But because we put all of them into a sort of resilience toolbox, we are looking at things a bit differently, and that is a point that I would like to insist upon. Why? We account for risk using a resilience approach. That is, we recognize the need to understand and take into account risks much more comprehensively and much better. And this is recognizing basically that shocks are a part of everyday life for vulnerable people. And this is a very important change. These are not exceptional events, these are normal events. So if they are normal, if they are going to come back, we need to anticipate them very well. And this is kind of new, Anticipation and preparedness is not new, but to systematize it is very new. The second point that's also extremely important is because you're looking at resilience, I said you're looking at vulnerability. So in order to tackle vulnerabilities, you need to have a long-term approach. Yeah, you can't do that through short-term humanitarian emergency assistance. So you're going to have a development approach towards what you're doing. And that's essential because basically, contrary to common wisdom, it means that some development paradigms are going to be applicable in contexts that are characterized by a lot of shocks. So in contexts that are, for instance, countries in high conflict or high crisis. In those contexts, usually, we do very short-term interventions. And that's probably where we were wrong in the past and what we should be doing in the future. So that's also a very, very significant change, I find. So like I said, the key words are to anticipate, to prepare, to reduce risk. This is what resilience is about. This is all working upstream. But at the same time, we know that we won't be able to stop everything, that shocks are going to happen, and people are going to suffer in spite of our efforts. So the approach recognizes also that relief and rehabilitation still have to be present. So interestingly enough, what you're saying is that in highly vulnerable contexts, think of South Sudan, think of Afghanistan, think of vulnerable contexts, you're going to combine a development approach with a humanitarian approach. And this is also very new because for those who know a little bit about development, those two streams of work are very separate. We usually try to mix them, but I think the resilience concept is one convener that's a bit more powerful than what we had in the past. So again, a very important change. In order to give you an example and a bit more meat, what is it that you can put in a resilience toolbox? Of course, I'm going to talk about what FAO does. We have basically 4 pillars to our resilience strategy. 1 is emergency, but 3 are development. So, as you can see, a resilience strategy is absolutely not an emergency response. On the contrary, it is a long-term response. So first of all, we look at the governance of risk. For instance, we try to mainstream disaster risk reduction approaches into agricultural policy frameworks. So to have at the national and subnational policy level frameworks that basically take into account risk much better. We also work a lot on information and early warning. So surveillance system, mapping system, on rains, prices, animal diseases, and that kind of things. Then third pillar, risk and vulnerability reduction interventions. So this is the most important and direct, not to try to basically address resilience. There are about 3 dimensions. The first one is to basically try to intensify production so that producers, fisher farmers, etc., have the means to produce more. So better access to natural resources, inputs, technologies, knowledge, and the like. So I'm just summarizing. Yeah? Another option is to diversify rather than intensify production. So producing different producers on the same piece of land. Transforming your produce or creating other job opportunities that are not necessarily related to agriculture. And finally, accessing markets, because of course, if you want all of that to work, you need to access local markets. Emergency response, very quickly, examples in the agricultural sector, but that's just one sector amongst others. Seed reserves, forest fire management, fisheries emergency management guidelines, livestock vaccination, cash for work. All of that, so these are the 4 pillars of FAO's strategy, but another important dimension of working on resilience is recognizing that a lot of those things cannot be done alone, and that resilience also required some type of multi-sectoral response, and that's why I have partnership there at the bottom. And with the example of Somalia, we can talk a little bit about partnerships. So on this slide, basically, I think there's a bit of a summary of what I said before, but applied to the Somalia context. Resilience is particularly relevant for a country like Somalia. First of all, because of the type of risks that you have. You have drought, floods, so climate-related risks that are very recurrent, but you also have a lot of conflict and insecurity. And these intertwined shocks are particularly complex to manage. You have very low institutional capacity owing to a poor governance structure. And vulnerability is extremely high. So you basically have all the ingredients which require a resilient strategy. In 2011, as it always does, the Horn of Africa experienced, because those shocks are recurrent, a drought crisis. So major drought. But we saw that the outcomes were much worse in Somalia. Why is that? The conclusion was a little bit, well, because we failed to build resilience in the first place, whereas we built it maybe a little bit better in other countries such as Kenya, and which are less prone to a myriad of shocks, right? So FAO, together with 2 other UN organizations, WFP and UNICEF, put together a resilience strategy which basically addresses several sectors, not just the agriculture sector, but also the basic services and the social protection sectors. It was basically looking at preventing crisis in the future, so avoiding what we saw in 2011. In 2011, it was just the consequence of 2 bad agricultural seasons, which were not even that bad. But like I said, when the resilience has been eroded, a small event can create big problems. So that's what we're trying to tackle here. So preventing crises, addressing root causes of the issues. In Somalia, we never work on the root causes. Well, we more and more do. But usually we sort of put some kind of band-aid with humanitarian assistance and we wait until the next crisis happens. So this is the exact contrary of doing that. This strategy was also very interesting for making the Somalis the providers of first resort. That is saying in the countries where the government structures are not necessarily providing the services that people deserve and should have to, live a decent living, then let's basically work with the communities to make those services available through communities. Also, we tried to, and that's very important in a resilience approach, we tried to basically base our approach in the existing resilience of Somalis, because if you think of it, yes, they're very vulnerable and very prone to, very exposed to risk, but they're also extremely resilient, taking into account everything that they're going through. And so Somalis have developed options and a diversification of their livelihoods means, which is extremely dynamic and interesting. And so the idea was to base the interventions on that. What was also innovative in this programming was to have the agencies working together, but through 3 different programs, and indeed to combine an approach through 3 pillars: enhancing income, Pillar 1, in the productive sectors, enhancing human capital, Pillar 2, and enhancing social protection to address basic needs, Pillar 3. And this cannot be done alone. This requires different people with different type of skills and combining a lot of sectors. So that makes it more complex, but that's much more efficient for building resilience. So just a picture to finish, and just to give you a few concluding remarks. Like those goats, if you're trying to build resilience, you need to try to find ways for people to adapt. Adaptation is the key word to resilience. Most likely people in their current livelihood system, in the way they live right now, because of the shocks that they experience, cannot pursue their living correctly. And so you need them to adapt to new options. And that's what I wanted to demonstrate with this picture. In terms of concluding words, I just want to highlight, to finish, that resilience is proven to be a cheaper way to tackle food insecurity. That is, the more you anticipate, the more likely you are to spend less money to achieve exactly the same result. When the shock has happened, when devastation has happened, you're going to spend a lot of money. So if you think about, for instance, cricket's invasion, and you think of the cost to basically have a surveillance system for the locust and use biopesticide to kill those that have already developed, as opposed to the cost of rebuilding livelihoods, distributing foods, if the harvest has been basically entirely swollen up by the locust. Well, it's about 1 to 60, the type of cost that we're talking about. I want to highlight also that resilience strategies are very challenging. I didn't have a lot of time, but I hope that I could convey that they're very comprehensive. They require multi-stakeholders approaches, and they're also very localized. A resilience strategy here is not going to be the same resilience strategy than there, because the risks and the vulnerabilities are not the same. So it's extremely challenging because you cannot have a blanket approach. However, I personally think that it is a change of mindset that's absolutely fundamental to do things better for the most vulnerable, and to recognize that we cannot do the same mistakes time and over again, and wait for the shocks to happen, and then realize that we didn't do the right thing. So on this note, thank you very much.